Welcome everybody to the doctoral defense of Ludwig, and my name is Monika Achtmann. I'm head of the Department of Food and Agriculture and Market Research, and it's a great pleasure for me to head this doctoral defense. It's wonderful to look around and see that so many people really want to support you on your last step to your PhD. Before I give the word to Mr. Ludwig, I would like to give a brief introduction into the procedure of this doctoral defense, and I also would like to take the time to introduce Mr. Ludwig. The defense is consisting of two parts. One part is a public part, where Mr. Ludwig first has the opportunity in 30 minutes to give an overview of the work he has done in the framework of his doctoral thesis. And afterwards there will be time for discussion, and all of you are invited to take part in this discussion and ask questions which might have come up during the presentation. This will take about 15 minutes, and after this time the public part is closed and there will be a so-called non-public part where the examination group will go, and I don't know, we probably stay here, Mr. Kamera, right? We stay here, and we will have the opportunity to have 30 to 90 minutes intensive discussion and exchange of ideas with Mr. Ludwig. And afterwards we see many of you stay there to see the outcome of this doctoral defense. So allow me at this point to introduce Mr. Ludwig. Mr. Ludwig has studied politics and economics and received his bachelor degree from the University of Bremen. And during his bachelor studies he spent one semester in Taiwan. I guess it must have been a decisive experience, because you stayed with many states later on also in other parts of the developing world. What followed was two master degrees, one master degree in agricultural economics from the University of Arkansas in the United States, and one in rural development from the University of Ghent in Belgium. Mr. Ludwig did not only gain experience abroad due to his studies, but he also had several internships in foreign countries, like one with the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Thailand, another one with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Myanmar. After his studies, he worked for a short period for the Boston Consulting Group, and then for more than 2 years with the GIZ, the German Society for International Cooperation. 2015, he started his work here at the Center for Development Economics, and he focused from that time on food security and on poverty. For his research he conducted, he spent 1 year in India, and furthermore he spent a sabbatical at the University of California in Berkeley. Mr. Ludwig received a considerable number of grants and fellowships awards, including the Hans H. Gutenberg Prize for his master's thesis. His thesis is dealing with consumption choice, the effects of production, markets and preferences on diets in India, and I look forward to hear more about it.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Ms. Hartmann. Dear colleagues and dear friends, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present my PhD research to you. It's a great pleasure and also a privilege to be here. My overall topic is on food consumption choices and the factors that influence these choices, and for that I was focusing on rural India. Let me start with giving you a motivation for my research, as well as the according background information. Food nutrition insecurity is a global problem. There are more than 800 million people who do not have enough calories to eat, meaning who suffer from food insecurity. Well, these are around 11% of the world population. And even more than 2 billion people, or around 27% of the world population, do not consume the right amount and diversity of micronutrients, meaning they are suffering from nutrition insecurity, which is also known as hidden hunger. And it has been found that the majority of food and nutrition insecure people are living in rural areas and work mostly in agricultural production or in activities along the agricultural value chain. And at the same time, there's also an increasing trend of overweight and obesity. And as a matter of fact, the numbers are almost mirrored. More than 600 million people are considered to be obese, and 2.1 billion people are overweight. Well, the prevalence of overweight is higher in developed countries, but the faster increase occurs in urban areas of developing countries. Martin Keim will present later on research which is partly related to overweight, but I focus in my PhD on micronutrient malnutrition. And micronutrient malnutrition has in the long run two different effects on two different levels. On the individual level, we can see a physical and cognitive development which is reduced, and on a societal level, public health has to cope with higher rates of non-communicable diseases, but also with lower, economically speaking, with a lower productivity. There are various indicators for micronutrient malnutrition, and anemia is often used as one decisive indicator, as it depicts a reduced iron consumption. And mapping the prevalence of anemia among women indicates the hotspots of micronutrient malnutrition, which is sub-Sahara Africa and also South Asia. And if we talk in terms of absolute numbers of anemic women, India is clearly the unfortunate leading country. Well, actually there's one saying about India which says, well, everything is true for India simply because of its sheer size, and in terms of food and nutrition security, it's certainly true that urban areas have a higher rate of overweight, and rural areas have a higher rate of underweight among women, men, and children alike. However, anemia, respectively micronutrient deficiency, is widespread throughout the whole country. There are some regional differences, as the map of prevalence of anemia shows, such as that Kerala in the south is a clear role model in terms of low malnutrition rates, but in the east, in Bihar, in Jharkhand and West Bengal, these states are suffering tremendously from high malnutrition rates. And micronutrient malnutrition is often caused by unbalanced diets. Well, these are diets that can be rich in calories, but are certainly poor in vitamins and minerals. And this can partly be explained by an unfavorable environment in terms of food price trends. There was a green revolution in India in the 1960s and 70s that developed high-yielding varieties of staple crops such as rice and wheat. And it was a very successful green revolution so that the growing population of India could be fed. But at the same time, the relative prices of micronutrient-rich foods, such as fruits and vegetables, increased. So over time, it was getting more expensive to eat healthy and diverse diets. The graph shows you here the diverging price trends of various food groups, and most noticeable, the cereals became relatively, that's the black line, became relatively cheaper over time. Well, this contributed certainly to reducing underweight, but it also led to an increase in micronutrient malnutrition. And so now the million-dollar question is how to counteract this development and how to incentivize and enable the people to eat more balanced diets in order to make them micronutrient nourished again. And there are many approaches to make diets diverse again, and one approach is nutrition-sensitive agriculture. And in this first analytical part of my presentation, I would like to focus on the effects that production diversity and markets have on food consumption. So, nutrition-sensitive agriculture partly shifts the focus of agricultural production from a higher productivity of one particular crop to a more diverse production, and in order to enable the consumer again to eat more diverse diets. And India's agriculture is driven by smallholder farming, largely, and therefore I would like to describe the link between production diversity and consumption diversity exemplarily for a smallholder farming household. And in general, a smallholder produces a certain diversity of crops on farm, which can be either sold in the markets or it can be directly consumed in the household. But for most of the smallholder farmers, it holds true that there's a mix of own consumption and market sales. The market sales generate some income, and the own consumption leaves still some desire for additional foods, as not every single food item can be produced by one farmer, meaning there are certain food expenditures for the household. In either case, the household tends to decide to purchase additional food items in combination with the consumption of its own produce, and this leads to a certain quality and dietary diversity. Given the nature of farming as a physical labor, the food consumption of the present tends to influence also the ability to work in the future, as well as it intends to influence the future decisions on production diversity, which is why you see the feedback loops here. Well, the two pathways are important to keep in mind. One to go via the production diversity affecting directly the consumption diversity through own consumption, and the other that the production choices will have an effect on consumption via the market sales. Well, there's already some empirical evidence on this link, and I present here a subset of the literature to display some indications. In African countries such as Malawi, Kenya, and Ethiopia, the link between production diversity and dietary diversity has been found to be strong. In Asian countries such as Indonesia, the effect is also significant but not as strong as in Africa. For market access, the effect is a little bit ambiguous. There are also various indicators to measure dietary diversity and micronutrient malnutrition, and the range of indicators gives also rise to different results on the effectiveness of production diversity. But it also opens up the problematic for using the right indicator for production diversity and consumption diversity alike. Importantly, most of the literature deals with correlations and relies on conceptual frameworks as I just presented, but the statistical causality is often lacking. Therefore, I found that I could make a contribution to the literature by answering the two basic research questions. Do production choices affect nutrition of smallholder farmers? And does market access influence this relationship? And my contribution to the literature here was primarily in finding a strong identification strategy, again, as most literature is only in the nature of correlation, and secondly, in focusing on India, where surprisingly few research has been done, despite the relevance of this topic. And of course, I also aim to use the correct methodology and have robust results. I used primary data that I collected in the first half of 2017 in India, namely in the 3 different states of Karnataka, Jharkhand, and West Bengal. This was a cross-sectional household level survey with stratified random sampling. I collected all information on food nutrition, security, anthropometrics, recall information on village level, and market information. I asked women and men, measured the children in each household, and conducted focus group discussions in total of 1,420 households. I started in Jharkhand, went then to West Bengal, and finished up in Karnataka, and I was based most of the time at the University of Kolkata in West Bengal. The choice for these regions was based on the fact of micronutrient malnutrition, as you saw in the beginning with the map, especially in East India, and in Karnataka, in the south of India, I went to particular hunger pockets. I used quantitative methods for answering the research question with a simple Poisson specification. I used two-stage least square, respectively the generalized method of moments for the IB approach, and I used an interaction between production diversity and market access. I controlled on individual, household, village, and of course regional level as well. The dependent variable is dietary diversity of women, and I would like to emphasize at this point the usage of this particular indicator, and not only for the research question but also in general. Dietary diversity is a proxy indicator for micronutrient malnutrition, similar as anemia that I showed earlier. This indicator is relatively cost-effective. It's a cost-effective way to measure, but it remains still the second best option. So better would have been to do a blood tissue analysis from certain vitamins and minerals, but unfortunately that was not possible due to budget constraints during the PhD. So dietary diversity in general is measured as a number of food groups that have been consumed by the woman of a household in the past 24 hours. Production diversity I measure similarly with the same food groups, but that have been produced by the household in the past season. Well, and market access is a dummy variable if a market is visited regularly by the household or not. Let me also briefly describe the identification strategy that I used. And agroecological zones indicate the scope of possible agrobiodiversity and also production diversity. These zones are usually characterized with levels of rainfall, with temperature, and also with altitude. And from these three characteristics, biodiversity literature mentions that the variance of rainfall can be a good estimator. I tested this by using satellite rainfall data, which I matched with the GPS location of the households that I interviewed. And specifically, I used the variance of yearly rainfall for the past 20 years in order to instrument current production diversity. The first stage results of this instrumental variable approach indicate that the estimator is significant and that the F-test is also acceptable. And keeping other possible pathways in mind, I'm also confident that the exclusion restriction is in this case met. So let us proceed to the results. And first I would like to show the results in a table format. And you can see here 4 different columns. And each column has a different specification, starting with OLS going to Poisson IV. And most interesting for us, of course, would be the Poisson IV specification. The other models are more for comparative purposes. And in the Poisson IV model, you can see that PD, which is production diversity, and here indicated with A, has a positive, well, and also a highly significant effect on dietary diversity. The interaction between production diversity and market access is first of all also significant, but it's negative. And remembering that market access is a dummy variable, meaning the interaction term cancels the effect of production diversity almost out if market access or if markets are visited regularly. And this particular effect, that the market access cancels out the production diversity, is known in the literature as a separability condition, meaning that the production decisions or the consumption decisions within a household can tend to be independent from production decisions if markets are involved. Additionally, you also see the effect, the positive effect of market access. And what is here very important is to see that the effect of market access is larger, considerably larger than the effect of production diversity. And so meaning, let's say if markets are met, the effect of production diversity is completely cancelled out, and only the market access effect retains. To make that more understandable, I have also a visual representation of this causal relationship. And on the y-axis of this graph, you see dietary diversity, and on the x-axis, production diversity. You see two lines. The blue line means market access is not involved, and the red line is with market access. The shaded areas are the 95% confidence intervals. And you can see, first of all, that there's in any case a positive relationship between production diversity and dietary diversity, but market access pushes the whole relationship a little bit further. So meaning production diversity is relevant, but market access is more relevant for improving dietary diversity. If we put numbers to it, we can say one food group higher production diversity can increase the dietary diversity by roughly 0.2 food groups. However, market access can push the dietary diversity generally up a little bit less than, pushes the dietary diversity up by a little bit less than one food group. So meaning this nutrition-sensitive agriculture approach is definitely aiming at improving diets from the supply side, but in economic literature, the demand side is sometimes neglected, at least when we talk about food nutrition security. Therefore, in the second part of this presentation, I would like to focus on the demand side and of consumption choices, and namely here on economic preferences. First of all, everybody has certain sensory preferences that influence your decision on what to eat. These sensory preferences can be in terms of taste or in smell. And this, I guess, is very well known to you. Everybody of you has certain preferences. But as an economist, I'm a little bit more interested in figuring out what are the effects that deep preferences can have on our own consumption choices. Meaning deep preferences are here subconscious tendencies that we are aware of when we think about these, but we are not really aware of these whenever we do something related to eating. And behavioral economics found 5 preferences to be decisive for economic behavior. This is risk preference, altruism, time preference, positive and negative reciprocity. And to explain you, for example, how altruism can influence your consumption choices, let me give you an example for the intuition. And let's take the example of a rural household in India. And I need to generalize a little bit in this regard, but usually it is the case that the woman prepares the food, that the man of the household eats the food first, then the children eat, and at the very end the woman eats something. There are various factors that influence the male, the household head, on how much food he leaves to eat for the rest of the family, and what kind of food he leaves for the rest of the family. But altruism is certainly one part of it. For example, if the household head would be completely egoistic, he would eat everything. He would consume the whole meal by himself and would not leave anything for the rest of the family. But certainly, of course, this doesn't happen. So there's some altruistic behavior of the household head that makes him leave some food available for the rest of the family. Well, that is one intuition that you can think about how altruism influences the choices of food that, for example, in this case, the woman will have at the end of the meal. If you talk about literature, how literature included preferences generally in food nutrition security concerns, well, literature has mostly considered these consumption choices in the sense of expected utilities, considering, for example, a certain discount rate, respectively a certain time preference. Particularly risk preference has been found to influence innovation, spending on savings or insurances, and whereas altruism is mostly found to influence intergenerational transfers or remittances. And in terms of food nutrition security, the literature has discovered that risk preference has an effect on food safety issues, such as GMOs or contaminated foods. Food security itself, however, has only been discussed in the terms of time preference. So, interestingly, there is a big gap in the literature on discussing how risk preference and altruism influence your own food choices or your diverse diets. So, accordingly, I set another research objective of my PhD in analyzing and estimating the effects that these particular preferences, namely risk preference and altruism, have on dietary choices. And given the scarcity of the literature, I had to first theoretically base the intuition. Then I prepared a survey tool that could elicit the preferences on a large scale. And thirdly, I had to, well, essentially hope for significant and relevant results in the empirical analysis. And I would like to start with showing you the theoretical model. Well, to formalize the intuition, I had to use, I used the expected utility framework that considers two periods, period 0 and 1, which is the present and the future. The idea is, the general idea is that the individual maximizes her utility by changing the nutrition level 0 and also savings 0 in the present. The utility is of course constrained by budget considerations, which are C0 and C1, meaning the budget for the present and the budget for the future. That's the general setup. Then in the first step I included uncertainty, future uncertainty, and the discounting rate. Future uncertainty is a range of varied shocks that might occur in the future. Here is seen with the integral and with phi x dx. Delta is a discount rate for the future, meaning how much do you value the future. I had to define the budget constraints, of course, and these are relatively simply defined, but I would like to mention the link that I have for future income generation. And here, future income depends on the wage rate of the future, of course, on certain shocks, which is the mean of expected shocks in the future, and this function of nutrition in the present. And this function of nutrition in the present, that's the key link here. Meaning, that's the outcome of the nutrition that you have in the present. So, for example, if you wouldn't eat anything at all in the present, the outcome in the future would be 0 simply because you would starve. So, the outcome of nutrition in the present would be 0, then the whole income, of course, in the future would also be 0. And that's the link are included in the expected utility. And if we bring this all together, we come up with this formula. That's the first step. The next step, of course, I wanted to include also risk preference. Risk preference in the literature is defined usually as the exponential function, which you can see is e to the power of. And risk is then defined as A. And here it's important to understand that risk-loving, so risk-taking behavior, is usually a negative A. Risk-neutral is A is equal to 0, and risk-averse would be a positive A. I transformed the integral in order to be able to work and calculate this equation. And I received essentially this whole format where also the risk is then included. But this is only the working formula, the working equation. What I actually want to find is the optimal nutrition level that maximizes the utility of the individual. And I won't go into details for all the calculations that I did. Just for your information, I calculated the first order conditions of savings and nutrition, and in order to single out the effect that preferences can have on nutrition. And I came up with the optimum in the end. The optimum looks like this. Here, the optimal nutrition level is represented as n star. And we see that the optimal nutrition level in the present is influenced by certain variables. You see here, delta again as a discount rate, mu as the mean of expected shocks. Of course, we have the wage rate, we have the price for nutrition, and we have essentially, well, this is the variance of the shocks, by the way, and this is the risk preference A. And that's, of course, the important factor that we want to have. So what would that mean? For example, the discount rate would increase. Discount rate is usually given between 0 and 1. If the discount rate increases to, let's say, 0.9, then the nutrition level in the present would also increase. Because the increasing discount rate means you don't value the future as much as the present. So you will consume pretty much more in the present. To show the relationship between, well, here particularly risk preference and optimal nutrition, I simulated the model. And what you can see here, we have on the y-axis the nutrition level, on the x-axis the risk preference. You see 3 lines, 3 relationships, having various discount rates, and this is exactly the relationship that I just mentioned. If the discount rate increases, your general nutrition level in the present will also increase. But what is most important is that you see if the risk preference gets negative, meaning if somebody becomes more risk-loving, the nutrition level will increase. Or if somebody is risk-averse, the nutrition level will be low. And that's the effect that I wanted to show with this model, and which also allows us to deduct some hypotheses coming from the theoretical model how risk preference influences nutrition. So this is only for risk preference. The same thing happens also for altruism, but here I only show you the theoretical concept in its basic form. And altruism in economic literature means that my own utility is enhanced by someone else's utility in the magnitude of my level of altruism. So if I'm altruistic and you're feeling well, I'm feeling a little bit more well as well. In terms of nutrition, that would mean if you feel well because I share my food with you, then I'm definitely encouraged to share my food with you because I feel a little bit more well as well. So accordingly, your available food would increase without you having to pay for it because I give it to you for free. Well, I integrated this approach, of course, also in the equation, in the utility equation that I had earlier. And the same exercise that I showed before could be essentially done with the altruism included in the equation. But for now, I think that's sufficient. And I would like to show the hypotheses that were deducted. And here we have the hypothesis, of course, that risk preference can positively affect nutrition. And altruism of a household member J, which J in this case would be the household head, towards another household member I, which would be the spouse of the household head, positively affects the nutrition of the household member I of the spouse. Well, in these 2 hypotheses I tested empirically. Let me briefly mention at this point how I elicited the preferences in the survey. I elicited the preferences with a hypothetical approach for the household head and spouse separately. For each preference I had a quantitative and qualitative part. The quantitative part were hypothetical games which allowed me to the large sample size. and the quantitative and qualitative parts were merged in an index on the z-scores of the full sample, which is a certain weight from a previous study. I transformed the preferences to 0 to 1 for a better interpretation. The estimation model is relatively simple. I use again a Poisson model because dietary diversity is a dependent variable again, and dietary diversity is a count variable with Poisson distribution. I of course control again on various levels, and I have two decisive factors that I want to measure the coefficients of. So these are the results. For the preference, you see again 4 different columns. All are Poisson specifications. DDW is a dietary diversity score of a woman. The columns represent various levels of included covariates. And you see the 2 different variables that I'm interested in, risk level and altruism. And what we can see first is that the variables, the coefficients are all significant, highly significant, very significant, and that there's a positive effect between the risk level and altruism on the dietary diversity as expected by the model. I also did that for other measures of food nutrition security, here with the household dietary diversity score and with the fees. And column 1 and 2 are the same results as you saw before, just for your information again and for comparison. We see for the HDDS, which is a household access, a food security access measure, that there's again a positive effect between risk and altruism. The same with fees. Well, this is negative because the fees, the food insecurity experience scale, is a little bit differently measured, but these essentially also confirm the results that those preferences have an effect on dietary diversity, on nutrition security. So if we calculate it and if we see what would that mean, it means if the risk level of the spouse increases by 10 percentage points, we have approximately a 0.8% higher dietary diversity. Same with the altruism of a household head. If this increases by 10 percentage points, we have a roughly 1.1% higher nutrition security of the woman. These results seem small, but remember these are just subconscious tendencies that can improve your nutrition, and in this regard they are big. So that's the part for preferences. Let me now conclude this presentation with a summary of the results and a few policy implications. First of all, I describe in my dissertation the unfavorable environment in India in terms of food price trends and the assumed effects on unbalanced diets. The prices of micronutrient-rich foods increased tremendously in comparison to staple crops, and partly as a result, micronutrient malnutrition is high throughout India, underweight rates decreased, and overweight rates increased. I could also show that there are causal effects between production diversity and food consumption, and that the market plays a significant role. And finally, I could show that the effects between economic preferences and food nutrition security are positive, as I just explained. In terms of policy implications, I would like to mention 3 points. Firstly, the need to balance food prices needs to be recognized to give incentive for balanced nutrition. Well, this can mean, for example, either subsidizing micronutrient-rich foods and taxing unhealthy foods. Secondly, programs for production diversity are definitely helpful, for farm-level effects at least, but possibly also for macroeconomic effects. However, improving market access is definitely more efficient for improving dietary diversity. And thirdly, as it became apparent that human behavior has an influence on nutrition choices, this understanding, of course, can improve nutrition programs and policies, but this understanding can also help to nudge or guide consumers towards a certain nutrition. Well, with this, I hope I could give you a glimpse on my research that I did for the past years. And before I close now, I would like to, of course, acknowledge a few people that have enabled me to come to this point of my PhD. And first of all, I would like to thank you, the dissertation committee, and for guiding me through this academic training, for making it to this point. My highest regards to go to Joachim von Braun for supervising me and partly also tutoring me for the past 3 years. Martin Keim, Thomas Heckelei, and Ms. Hartmann, thank you very much for being here today. I received tremendous support by my colleagues in India, in the US, and also here in Germany at CEF. Thank you very much for this. Financial support was, of course, given by BMZ, by the Foundation Fiat Panis, and also DAAD. And last but not least, I owe a large part for making it up to this point to my data enumerators in India, to all my friends and colleagues here at CEF, and certainly also to Guido Lüchters, who was very helpful. And with this, I would like to close, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ludwig, to give us such an interesting overview of the dissertation, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions and comments out there, and I want to encourage you to mention those.
Thanks, Mr. Ludwig. I start with a very general question that's related to your motivation, and it's a two-part question. The first one is you mentioned that micronutrient deficiencies lead to non-communicable diseases. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about this, because those NCDs are usually the ones that people put more into the area of calorie overnutrition. But I want to hear what NCDs you have in mind. The second part of the question, also quite general, is I believe I've heard you saying that the Green Revolution in India contributed to high levels of micronutrient malnutrition. I may have misheard you, but I think that's what you said, at least in between lines. And I wanted to have a few sentences of explanation. Is that really true, and how much do we know about that question, whether or not the Green Revolution as such deteriorated micronutrient malnutrition?
Should I?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, first regarding, thank you very much for the questions. First regarding the non-communicable diseases, of course I didn't do any research on those non-communicable diseases. I took it from the literature, primarily from Professor Wisalski's literature. And what I found there, of course, like the most well-known NCD that is always talked about is diabetes, but this of course has different effects also why diabetes comes into place. There are micronutrients? I know, there are particular NCDs that are related to micronutrient deficiencies. I mentioned anemia quite a few times, iron deficiency, which can lead to my understanding, to also loss of eyesight, and particularly, again, to a reduced development of your general physical abilities and cognitive abilities. But again, these are effects that I couldn't look into during my PhD, but which I only took from the literature. Regarding the Green Revolution question, of course, like improving the high-yielding varieties, or developing high-yielding varieties doesn't have effect per se on the micronutrient nutrition, but what it does definitely have an effect, or does have an effect on, is on the prices of these staple crops. And as I showed you earlier, with the diverging price trends, what you could see particularly is that the cereal prices decreased, and this is certainly part of a higher supply of staple crops. And in comparison to that, that's a relative price, simply because the prices of staple crops such as wheat and rice decreased, the relative prices of micronutrient-rich foods increased. Meaning it would be harder, keeping the same budget allocation of the household in mind, it would be harder for the household to buy micronutrient-rich foods, fruits, vegetables, in comparison to staple crops. That's the indirect effect, definitely, but not a direct effect. But that's, again, how the literature talks about it.
I think I do agree, but what you're saying, if the budget remains the same, the budget doesn't remain the same if the staple food prices decrease, right? And that's something we must not forget. So if staple foods become cheaper, you're getting richer in real terms, and that's an effect that may contribute to improved micronutrient consumption. But I think those are open questions empirically, so that's not a criticism. I just warn for making too quick statements about causal effects.
Okay. But like the price trends, at least that I showed, were all real prices. I at least deflated these with the consumer price index. And
those are real prices, but those are not the effects of the Green Revolution.
We might have later on still some time to discuss that point. But
so thanks for the presentation. I mean, so given that you use your cross-sectional data, what do you think are the likely limitations of the study?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Of course, like cross-sectional data, this is one of the biggest limitations that I have in this research, and in terms of empirical analysis, at least. And certainly, it would have been much better to use panel data, or to have at least some longitudinal data where I can see the various effects over time. If I talk about the effects of production diversity, or nutrition security, or on dietary diversity, of course, there's another effect that would have been super interesting and definitely have a clear effect on food nutrition security, which is seasonality, which you cannot really figuring out with cross-sectional data, for which I would have needed longitudinal data. And yeah, it would have simply be much stronger results in terms of robustness also. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. For research question, in your first research question, you are assuming that households produce equal shares of different foods and consume equal shares of different food categories. I was wondering how relaxing that assumption would affect your results. Some food categories may be more nutritious, some food categories may be less nutritious, so what matters perhaps is what you eat than how many types of things that you eat. So I was wondering if you had to look at the actual impact on the nutrition part.
What do you mean with actual impact on the nutrition part? Which food group is consumed or which food item is consumed? That's what you mean?
Yeah, what I mean is that you are assuming that households consuming equal shares of different food categories.
Yeah.
It may be that they are consuming more of that and less of that.
Yeah.
And for nutrition, it may matter.
Yes, definitely. I cannot completely and fully respond to this question simply because I haven't looked into it, but you are certainly right. Let me mention 2 points. One point, dietary diversity is definitely a proxy indicator. There were some tests to figuring out how much does the minimum dietary diversity score in this case reflect micronutrient malnutrition, and I think it's only about 60% or something of the whole micronutrient malnutrition. So definitely there's some lacking relationship which food groups can simply not explain. But as a second point, I would like to show you one part, the effect of market access on dairy consumption. Well, I could see 3 food groups that are particularly affected by an increase in market access, which is on the one hand, well, dairy consumption, nuts consumption, and, well, vegetable consumption, interestingly. And what you can see here, this is again just the market access. You see the market access has differing results on certain food groups. And I have here various income quintiles, not only on certain food groups, but also on various income quintiles. So there are varying effects, but I cannot go further than saying that there are varying effects.
Other questions? Yes.
Here, it's about the you were like 30. You were calling about the head of the household eating some food for the other members. But to which extent? Because you say that this could improve the variety of the spoons, like of the dietary intake of the spoons. But also, to which extent would that be like a limitation? So the head of the household is not receiving enough dietary diversity, or is not having enough food.
Yeah, actually that's a very nice point. It's reversing the question, right? You are asking, okay, does it have a negative effect on the household health? That's your question, right? Yeah, super interesting. I haven't looked into that. Usually when you talk about food nutrition security, those people who you want to improve, or whose nutrition you want to improve is, well, the woman or the children of the household. The man is mostly a little bit neglected, also in terms of figuring out what his nutrition is. And yeah, well, just mentioning again, altruism is one factor that can influence the decision on if there's something left for the woman or for the rest of the family at all. But it's certainly not, well, I'm not even sure if it's a decisive factor. I'm just making clear that there is one factor which is like a personal trait of the household head that can influence it. What effect it has on the household head, I cannot say. And
Thanks a lot, Till, for your nice presentation. Can you come back on your results of the second part? You present in your table, you presented this. You said that could you come back a little bit on the effects that you found? You said like if we were to have 10%, that would, you know, because those were small effects, and you said overall it was still important. Can you maybe come back on this a little bit?
So first of all, it's important to understand again how risk level is, what is the unit essentially of risk level. As I mentioned earlier, the preferences I transformed to a 0 to 1 scale. So meaning is essentially 100% that somebody can have a certain risk level. So, and what I said is this risk level increases by 10 percentage points, meaning from 0.1 to 0.2, for example. We would have an effect size here, which would be like if we see the whole unit of 0.8%. If we would increase by, let's say, one whole unit, we would go from 0.1 to 1.1, which is out of scale, so it doesn't really make sense to have this level of effect. That's why I increase it only by 10 percentage points, essentially. But is it here?
I have two questions for you. The first question relates to your use of the Poisson regression model. We know that the Poisson model actually assumes accurate dispersion, right? So mean variance equality. And I'm wondering whether you actually looked at the distribution of your consumption data to see whether they're equidispersed and how you handled most likely the observed local dispersion. And secondly, in your conclusion, or let's say in your policy recommendations, the first point you talk about is that India should contribute to balancing food prices to enhance the consumption of micronutrients. And I'm wondering now that India already has a massive food subsidy scheme in place, whether you could give a more, let's say, detailed policy recommendation of how that would actually work in such a food subsidy scheme.
Yeah, firstly, the first question had two approaches to figuring out if Poisson specification is the right specification. First, let me go and show you, for example, here the distribution. This is the distribution of dietary diversity. And you see, well, 0, of course, like, mostly doesn't exist, but we have, like, it's not a perfect, like, normal distribution. I could consider it more as a Poisson distribution. But, of course, like, I had to check first for that. And I did this first with a negative binomial model. And for seeing if there's any difference between the negative binomial model with the Poisson regression, right, and the alpha actually indicated, well, that Poisson can be used. So I prefer to use a Poisson regression for this. And this is essentially how I approach it. Regarding the food price support, or the minimum food price support system in India as it exists, is all, well, to my understanding, is supposed to be focused on staple food, staple crops, essentially. Right? And so meaning that the policy, the grand policy of India is to enable most of the population to have sufficient food to eat, to have sufficient calories to eat, but not so much on having a diversity to eat. There are some other policies in place that look into particular population groups. For example, there are Anganwadi centers which are looking into the nutrition of children, and also to enable children to eat more diverse diets. But the broad policy in order to pushing or to lowering prices of micronutrient-rich foods is, to my knowledge, not in place.
There's a very last short question, please, which I'm taking.
In your measure for dietary diversity, I'm wondering why specifically 24 hours as opposed to maybe more hours or even days, which I'm assuming would give a better picture in terms of diversity.
Yeah, definitely. And so I use the indicators again on the basis of literature review. I don't want to make any comment on which indicator is the better indicator to use because I simply not looked into it. But what the literature says that if you look into a particular dietary diversity of women, so meaning you want to figuring out what the nutrition security of the woman is, then you have to look into a 24-hour food recall. Simple as that. If you have a different indicator as a household dietary diversity score, which is again more a food access measure on the whole level of the household, then you have a 7 days food report. But this is for household dietary diversity score. And I simply use the indicators that are best used according to the literature. And you will definitely find different results if you extend the recall period. But again, this is how it's used.
So at this point I'd like to thank all discussants for those interesting questions, and I'd like to thank you, and I think we should also give them a